Well, thank you for staying around. And I really enjoyed getting a chance to visit with all those that I did, and I'm happy to hang around and visit with everyone. And just appreciate the opportunity to be with you so much. Well, as I mentioned, the subtitle of my book is How the Deep State Capitalizes on Crises to Consolidate Control. So, I've spent several years researching every civilization that has ever existed on the planet and found, hands down, the most common form of government is a king. They go by different names: Pharaoh, Caesar, Kaiser, Sultan, Tsar. And it's the default setting for human government. So you put some kids in a playground, one's the bully, put some junior high girls in a clique, one's the diva. And so as the centuries go on, the kingdoms get bigger. Now, democracies and republics are attempts to take the power of the king and separate it and give it to the people. Demos means people, krasi means rule, democracy, the people rule. 6,000 citizens in Athens, and everybody had to be at every meeting every day to talk about every issue. Very time consuming, and if you didn't keep up with what they're talking about today, you're called an idiotus, an idiot. So democracies were limited as to how big they could get because logistically everybody had to be at every meeting every day. Republics were different. Republic is where you're in charge, but you're taking care of your family and your farm, and you have someone in your place that goes to the market every day and talks politics. They are your representative. So it's easy to remember the REP in republic is basically the same as the REP in the word representative. So Republican form of government, you're in charge, you're just ruling through representatives. So either way, republics and democracies are attempts to take the power of the king and give it to the people. But what if the king wants the power back? Does he just go to the people and say, "Hi, I want to be king, give me control of your life"? "Oh, sure, yeah, here you go." Is that how it works? No. And so there are two methods at which the king can take the power back. One is fear. When people get afraid, they will trade freedom for security. And the other is free stuff. The king's so nice, he's giving you free stuff, and you get dependent on it, and then you incrementally give up your freedoms to continue. Sort of like a drug dealer takes over a neighborhood two ways. He can come in with guns and kill people, and everybody gets fearful, and they're willing to trade their freedom to the mob in exchange for staying alive. But the other way is the drug dealer can give away free drugs. He's so nice, and then people get hooked. And then he says, "Oh, you want some more free drugs? You're going to sell yourself into prostitution, rob from your neighbor." And it's like a hunter catches animals through guns or bait. I was actually reading how to catch pigs in the wild. And you put a post in the ground and you throw some corn down, and the pigs come and eat the corn. And the next day you put 2 posts in the ground and throw the corn. And then 3 posts, and then you start putting them in a little semicircle, and then you start putting the fencing in between until pretty soon there's just a little opening. And the pigs come and they ignore what's going on and they just eat the corn, and you shut the gate and you caught yourself some wild pigs. Right? And so the scriptures that deal with this is Proverbs 29:25. Fear of man bringeth a snare. What's a snare? A snare is a trap. So fear is a trap. And then the other is the free stuff. But every man, when he is tempted, he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. Right? So you can use the temptation to catch people with free stuff. So we're seeing that the deep state creates or capitalizes on chaos and discord. Then in the atmosphere of fear promises a solution of free stuff, and it turns into dependency and control. So let's look at a couple more scriptures. How do you create fear? Classic method is you create a climate of insecurity. You create discord. And so the scriptures, Psalm 133, it says, "How good and pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity." Everybody say unity. And then Proverbs 6 says, 6 things the Lord hates. The last is he that soweth discord. Everybody say discord. So we have unity and discord. When there's unity, there's peace, everybody's and then discord is where you feel insecure and you're willing to give up your freedoms for security. Imagine being in heaven and somebody sows discord in heaven. Well, that's what Lucifer did, right? Got a third of the angels to be in discord, and they're kicked out. And then the devil sows discord in the garden and gets Adam to blame Eve, and then he has Cain kill Abel. And so we look at this period of the Hebrew Republic, the first 400 years out of Egypt, where there's no king. And Gideon had just defeated 100,000 Midianites. There is no threat to Israel. It is at peace. But Gideon has an illegitimate son named Abimelech, and he wants power, and he decides to sow discord. So he's the first one on record to do critical race theory, right? Identity, race, politics. Why? To sow discord. So he goes to the city of Shechem, and he says, is it better for you that all the sons of Gideon reign over you? Remember also that I am your bone and your flesh. And the men, brethren, spake of him in the ears of the men of Shechem, and their hearts inclined to follow Abimelech, for they said, he is our brother. So forget whether he's good at ruling or not. He's just one of us. We're identifying with him on the flesh and bone level. And then Abimelech goes to the city treasury, and he takes money to hire rioters. Antifa-type people, right? And they commit violence. It says, and they gave him 70 pieces of silver out of the house of Baal-berith, wherewith Abimelech hired vain and worthless persons which followed him, and they went unto his father's house at Ophrah and committed violence and slew his brethren. And then the men of Shechem made Abimelech king. So we go from a peaceful country to somebody sowing discord, and then in that chaos usurping power to make himself king. Now, the Hebrew Republic would have ended here rather than a century later with King Saul had not someone threw a millstone over the wall and it killed Abimelech. Well, let's look at another example of sowing discord. Italy, 500 years ago. It was a bunch of city-states. Venice, Genoa, Naples, Florence, Siena. They all had armies and navies and fought. And Machiavelli thought if one prince could control all of these Italian city-states, it would end the infighting. And so his end was good. And so the phrase was the ends justifies the means. The end of one prince controlling all of Italy is such a good end because it'll stop all this infighting that any means necessary to get there is justified. Lie, cheat, steal. So if a prince conquers a city and the city does not want to be conquered, they would hate the prince. But if the prince pays criminals to kill cows, burn barns, smash windows, sort of like Abimelech hiring vain and worthless persons, the people will panic in fear and want some governor to come along and fix this mess. And the prince can come in, get rid of the very criminals he bribed to start the problems. Nobody will know the better for it, and everyone will praise the prince as a hero. And so it's good marketing. You create the need and fill it. You go around the back of the house and set it on fire, and then you go around the front of the house and sell them a fire extinguisher. And they'll pay anything for it, and even thank you for being there. So you create the need and fill it. It's called Machiavellianism, where you create or capitalize on a crisis to consolidate control. You know that quote a little more recently, Rahm Emanuel said, you don't ever want a crisis to go to waste. It's an opportunity to do important things you would otherwise avoid. Or Hillary said, I'm actually excited about this opportunity, this crisis. The chief of staff for President Obama is an old friend of mine and my husband's, and he said, you know, never waste a good crisis, and that's what we're trying to do. Ben Domenech was on Fox Primetime, said the authoritarian left is using the permanent pandemic to achieve as many ends as they can imagine. This is Rahm Emanuel's famous dictum, never let a crisis go to waste. Normal times don't produce the outcomes that the authoritarian left wants because people are not scared enough to give them the limitless power they crave. Crises are necessary, and therefore, if there aren't any on offer, they manufacture them. And so you and I see a crisis, our response is how can we help people through it? They see a crisis, their response is how can we usurp power through it? Henry Louis Mencken wrote in 1956, the urge to save humanity is almost always a false face for the urge to rule it. Reagan, California, said one of the traditional methods of imposing statism or socialism is medicine. It's a healthcare crisis. It's easy to disguise a medical program as a humanitarian project. What's he talking about? It's called seizing the moral high ground, virtue signaling. Casinos do it. If a casino wants to move into an area and the area does not want the casino, they'll cite statistics of crime going up. But if the casino can give some money to schools, they can seize the moral high ground and claim that they care about the children. And if you care about the children, you'll vote for more casinos. And if you're not out there campaigning for casinos, you must hate the children. They're presenting themselves as more moral than you. They've seized the moral high ground. And so Reagan's talking about it's easy to do that and institute socialism through a healthcare crisis because they can claim that they care more about people's health than you do. What about all the alternative protocols? You can't talk about those, right? You have to surrender your body to the state or you must hate the children. You must hate your grandmother. You must hate your friend. And Daily Caller had this editorial cartoon, two scientists looking through a microscope saying, it appears to be mutating into a totalitarian dictatorship. Reagan said, if you don't stop this, behind it will come other federal programs that will invade every area of freedom until one day we will awake and find we have socialism. And now the response to usurpation is resistance. Every individual has to push back. So, used to be, we had great politicians in Washington, right, like Chris Kobach, and they were holding back the floodgates of hell. But we had someone do what was called certify. Of course, I don't think that was because the word certify means to make certain. And anyway, on January 6th, and the umbrella got ripped, and now it's raining down upon every one of us. And it's up to every female athlete to push back. It's up to every school mom to push back. It's up to every student to push back. It's up to every pastor to push back. It's up to every local sheriff to push back. It's up to every person to push back. Now, we're talking about Lucifer sowing discord in heaven and then sowing discord in the garden, Cain killing Abel, and then Abimelech sowing discord, and then Machiavelli sowing discord and taking advantage to seize and consolidate power. Let's look at the British Empire. It became the biggest empire on planet Earth. 13 million square miles, 500 million people, all of India, Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong, British Guyana, Canada, Barbados, Bermuda, Jamaica, and America. The King of England was a globalist. He was a one world government guy with him at the top. And do you think the British just marched into a country and said, hi, we want to be the biggest empire on planet Earth. Give us control of your country. Oh, sure, yeah, here you go. You think that's how it happened? Let's look at India. So in 1714, the British landed in Bengal and opened a trading post that turned into a trading fort that turned into them having guns and turned into them noticing the local politics and giving guns to one kingdom and guns to another kingdom and then stirring up discord, stirring up ancient animosity between these different kingdoms until it broke out into warfare and fighting and bloodshed. And then the British came in to restore order. And they would take control of both of them. And they did this again and again and again till they took over all of India, a quarter of the world's population. They actually tried doing this in America during the Revolutionary War. British General Johnny Burgoyne lands in Canada and is marching down toward Albany, New York. And the Americans and the Indians had reached an equilibrium, right? And the British come in and offer the Mohawk Indians money for scalps. And they would go in front of the British Army and scalp. Right? The famous story was a guy named David Jones engaged to a girl named Jane McCrae, and they were British loyalists, and the Indians couldn't tell the difference between an American and a British loyalist. All sort of looked the same to them. And they scalped Jane McCrae, and they come into the British camp with all their scalps. And David Jones sees this nice, pretty scalp, and he goes, it was his fiancée. And so Burgoyne has to meet with the Indians and tell them to tone it down. And the Indians don't know tone it down, so they get offended and leave. And now the Americans have the advantage, and they capture 6,000 British at the Battle of Saratoga. Anyway, so this idea of the British coming in and stirring up crises, they did again during the matter of fact, this is mentioned in our Declaration of Independence. So here it lists about 28 different reasons we were rebelling against the king, and one of them is the king has excited domestic insurrection among us, and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare was an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. In other words, the Indians knew on and off. They knew peace, they knew war. And when it was on the war mode, they didn't know any limited warfare. It was total. And Then the War of 1812. The British controlled Pensacola, Florida. Just north was Fort Mims, Alabama, and the Red Stick Creek Indians. You know the French pronunciation of Red Stick? Baton Rouge, like Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Anyway, so the British go to the Red Stick Indians and promise them money for scalps. And the Indians capture Fort Mims, Alabama, and they capture 500 people. And then they proceed to scalp all the 500 people that they had captured. The historical marker says here in Creek Indian War 1813-14 took place the most brutal massacre in American history. Indians took the fort with heavy loss and then killed all but some 36 of the some 550 in the fort. Creeks have been armed by British at Pensacola in this phase of the War of 1812. Do we really think the British cared about the Red Stick Creek Indians? No, they were wanting to stir up this division between them and the Americans because they wanted to conquer the whole thing. Washington warns of this in his farewell address. He says, disorders, discord, miseries gradually incline the minds of men to seek security in the absolute power of an individual. They want some governor to come along and fix this mess. And this individual turns this disposition to the purposes of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty. Jealousies, false alarms, kindles the animosity of one part against another. Foments occasional riots and insurrection. It opens the door to foreign influence and corruption, which find a facilitated access to the government itself through the channels of party passion. So the foreign power comes in and says, hey, we'll help you against that other party. And they're like, really? You're so nice, you want to help us? Nuh-uh, they're going to take advantage of the division so they can conquer all. Let there be no change by usurpation. Usurpation is doing something you're not authorized to do, but people let you get away with it because you're telling them that you're taking away their freedoms for their own good. Washington says, encroachment tends to consolidate the powers of all departments in one, and thus to create, whatever the form of government, a real despotism. A despot is someone with absolute and arbitrary power. Absolute means the moment they say it, it's the law. Right? The moment they issue a mandate, it's the law. And arbitrary is you don't know what they're going to issue next. Right? Usurpation, this is a key quote from Washington's farewell address. Usurpation, though in one instance may be the instrument of good, it is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. So here's Washington's farewell address. He says, watch out in times of disorder and miseries and crises when somebody comes along saying, I want to do something good, I just need to take away some of your freedoms to do it. He says, this is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. This is his farewell address. Usurpation must always greatly overbalance in permanent evil any transient temporary benefit which the use can at any time yield. So he says, watch out for a politician that says, we have to hurry up and pass this health care bill so we can find out what's in it. Or a politician that says, I don't have time to wait for Congress. I got my pen and my phone. I'm just going to do it. And they say, well, he wants to do something good, so go ahead and let him usurp power. Not realizing that he's setting a precedent that the next leader is going to take on to the next step until pretty soon it's all going to be back. Now, so we talked about Lucifer sowing discord in heaven, in the garden, Abimelech sowing discord, Machiavelli sowing discord, the British sowing discord. But let's go back to Europe. We have Hegel. So Napoleon conquers Europe. 6 million die in the Napoleonic Wars. He's finally forced to be banished to the island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic. And Europe's piecing itself back together. And the king of Prussia said, we can't get conquered that easy again. We need to strengthen the state. And he gets a philosopher to do it named Hegel. Hegel influenced Charles Darwin and Karl Marx. Karl Marx was a member of the Young Hegelians, a radical student group at the University of Berlin. And so Hegel had something called dialectics, Hegelian dialectics. It's a triangle. One corner is a thesis, the opposite corner is an antithesis or antithesis, and the top corner is a synthesis. It sounds complicated, but it's not. In other words, Marx says the thesis is the status quo. It's the way things are, and everybody's reached a level of equilibrium. The thesis is the status quo. You have to create an antithesis. You have to create a problem that's really bad. You have to sow discord. And when the problem is really bad, everybody panics in fear and is willing to trade some of their freedom for security. And that's when you consolidate power in the synthesis. And then that becomes the new starting point. You create another problem that's really bad, and everybody panics and surrenders some more of their freedoms to settle for an answer that's just half as bad. And then you create more discord and cause another problem that's real bad, and everybody will give up some more of their freedoms to settle for an answer that's just half as bad. And every time they settle, power and rights go from the individual to the state. And so how do you create a problem that's really bad? You send in agitators, community organizers, labor organizers, provocateurs. Their goal is to sow discord. And then when there's domestic insurrection and it gets fearful enough, everybody will, trade their freedom for security. So Karl Marx called this critical theory. And so you would observe a country and categorize all the groups in the country, economically, religiously, ethnically, racially, doesn't matter. You would call some victims and others oppressors, some haves and others have-nots. And then you would orchestrate protests and riots, and then when it got bad enough, everybody would panic and fear and trade freedom for security, and they would usurp power. So originally, it was called critical economic theory. And he would organize the proletariat against the bourgeoisie, the working class against the business owners, the poor against the rich. But then they would organize blacks against the whites, Catholics against the Protestants, Muslims against the Christians. They'd even organize the Hutus against the Tutsis in the Congo and Rwanda. This is interesting. In the Congo and Rwanda, the people saw themselves as one. But the Belgian and German colonizers would come in and measure them and their features and say, you're a Hutu and you're a Tutsi. They literally created artificial racial distinctions that had not been there before. And then they stirred them up against each other to fight and even genocide each other. And then in the confusion, like the British Empire, they would come in and take over the whole thing to restore order. Could you imagine the government breaking people into groups in order to pit them against each other? Castro says the revolution needs the enemy. The revolutionary needs his antithesis, which is the counter-revolutionary. In other words, you can't organize people against nothing. You need an enemy to organize against. And if there isn't, and if their enemies were lacking, they had to be fabricated, right? You had to create them out of nothing, right? And so, white nationalist supremacists, right? You have to create. And so Jesus in the book of Mark says, if a kingdom be divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. This is the strategy. This is critical race theory. Break people into groups, pit them against each other, and then it causes division, and then you can take over the kingdom. And it's like an autoimmune disease to the body politic. You get the body to attack itself. What's an autoimmune disease? That's where your own immune system starts attacking your own organs. You get your body to internally attack itself. And so this is the body politic. You want to get people to, patriotism is the enemy. You want to stop focusing on us being one. You break us into subgroups and pit them against each other. And Franklin Roosevelt said, whoever seeks to set one nationality against another seeks to degrade all nationalities. Whoever seeks to set one race against another seeks to enslave all races. The so-called racial voting blocks are the creation of designing politicians who profess to be able to deliver them on election day, right? So you're breaking people into groups for a push your advantage. FDR said, remember the Nazi technique? Pit race against race, religion against religion, prejudice against prejudice, divide and conquer. Charles Barkley on CBS Sports said, man, I think most white people and black people are great people. I really believe that in my heart. But I think our system is set up where our politicians, whether they're Republican or Democrat, are designed to make us not like each other so they can keep their grasp of money and power. They divide and conquer. We're so stupid following our politicians, except for the great ones you have here. Their only job is, hey, let's make the whites and blacks not like each other. Let's make rich people and poor people not like each other. Let's scramble the middle class. I truly believe this in my heart. You know, Malcolm X in 1963 says, the white liberal differs from the white conservative. Both want power. But the white liberal has perfected the art of posing as the Negro's friend and benefactor to use the Negro as a pawn or weapon in the political football game, and the white liberals control the ball. Now let's look at how this began to come to America. 1894, Chicago has a railroad car company called Pullman. And they had a little village where the workers lived, and then they bought stuff at the local grocery store, and it was all a company-like little village. And then they had an economic downturn, and the railroad car company couldn't pay their workers what they used to. And the people were disgruntled. They had grievances. And somebody came in to organize them. His name was Eugene Debs. And he sows discord amongst the workers. And he organizes them to protest, to riot, and to commit violence. And they riot and destroy $80 million worth of railroad cars in 27 states. And since everything in America is shipped on railroads, the entire country is paralyzed. This caused the whole country to just panic and fear. Could you imagine somebody organizing riots and violence that would go from city to city to city all around America? And so Eugene Debs then founded the Socialist Party of America. He runs for president 5 times between 1900 and 1920, one time from prison. And then in 1920, branching off of the Socialist Party of America, is the Communist Party USA. They run candidates for president every year from 1920 to 1940. What happened in 1940? FDR makes a treaty with Stalin during World War II. And the Communist Party USA says, why should we run our own candidates when here we have a Democrat candidate that's making treaties with Stalin? So that's when they began to infiltrate that party, and it's documented. Even Ronald Reagan, who had been a Democrat, said, I didn't leave the Democratic Party, the party left me. Zell Miller, the last pro-life Democrat U.S. Senator. I met him years ago at a CPAC meeting, but he says, unfortunately, the National Democrat Party has been taken over by the very liberal, left-wing leaning special interest groups in Washington. So it's documented, right? Here he is, a Democrat senator, saying his party has been taken over. Now, Albert Hurlong was a Democrat congressman in Florida, and he reads into the congressional record 45 goals of the communists to take over America in the year 1963. And one of them was capture one or both of the political parties. So lest you think one party is immune to being attacked, no, you need money to run. And so they would want to try to buy their way in. Resist any attempt to outlaw the Communist Party. Do away with loyalty oaths or pledges of allegiance. Now, back over to Germany. So we talked about Hegel, but now we're up to the 1920s. Germany is a republic, the Weimar Republic. So the people are in charge through their representatives. Somebody starts a party called the National Socialist Workers' Party. You know it better by the acronym Nazi. And Hitler becomes the head of this party. And the party has a violent arm to it, sort of an under-the-table, sort of an Antifa-type group, and it's called Brown Shirts. And they're nicknamed Sturmabteilung, which means stormtroopers, because they would storm into the meetings of Hitler's opponents and disrupt the meeting and shout down the speakers. Like if there's some speaker on campus and they don't like him, they'll just cause so much disruption that the meeting has to be canceled. And then these stormtroopers, these brown shirts, would lock arms and block access to public buildings. Could you imagine people locking arms in public and like blocking things? And then they blocked streets. And then they went into the cities and they smashed windows and looted and set on fire over 7,500 stores owned by Jews in the night of broken glass, Kristallnacht. And then their capital got attacked, the burning of the Reichstag. And evidence points to Hitler's own people setting the fire. But Hitler, in the confusion, blames his innocent political opponents and decides to do investigations and decides to detain people indefinitely and then decides to kill them all without a trial. And when the dust settled, Hitler didn't have any political opponents left. And Germany transitions from a republic, ruled bottom up, to a dictatorship ruled top down. A similar thing happened in Russia with Stalin. Stalin was facing a growing anti-Stalinist movement in 1934, and Stalin had a popular supporter, Sergei Kirov, the party boss of Leningrad. He was so popular, they actually built a statue to Sergei Kirov. And Stalin had an idea. He would assassinate his friend, Sergei Kirov, and eliminate a potential rival, but he would blame the assassination on his political opponents. Nobody would suspect him of doing it because he and Sergei were such good friends, and everybody would believe the anti-Stalinists did it because they didn't like Stalin, they didn't like Sergei. Stalin used this as an excuse to do an investigation, to round up, and to kill over 1 million people in the first Great Purge of 1936 to 38. And Erdogan did a similar thing in Turkey, right? So he staged a coup. I mean, he goes up in an airplane, flies in a circle, and comes down and says, oh, there was a coup against me. He just happens to have a list of 30,000 of his political opponents, has them all zip-tied, taken away. They've not been seen since. And now Turkey's being run as a dictatorship. So this is sort of standard operating procedure, right? You want to seize power, you do something, and you blame it on your innocent opponent and use it as an excuse to go after them. You know, Tucker Carlson aired this video of the very first people that came into the Capitol. And they broke in, and they're all dressed in black with tactical gear. And at the rally, there were no large group of people dressed in black with tactical gear. And then we begin to see that the FBI had operatives in the crowd. And one of them was the guy, Ray Epps, and who was the night before saying, we got to break into the Capitol, we got to break into the Capitol. And all the first-person responses were, oh, it was cold that day and the doors opened from the inside. Or somebody thought they were getting a free tour of the Capitol. It was called entrapment. It's sort of like, remember the kidnapping plot of Michigan Governor Whitmer? And like a dozen people were involved, and like half of them were FBI agents that were organizing everything, planning everything, paying for everything, and then the other half were a bunch of low IQ people that they'd call up and say, you got to be there. And he's like, okay. And then they would arrest them. So we broke up this plot. It's something called psychological projection or blame shifting, where the attacker blames the victim. It was the psychologist Sigmund Freud coined the term. By the way, in the first session, I mentioned the Margaret Thatcher quote, and I accidentally said Margaret Sanger. Somebody pointed that out to me. So I am human. I do make mistakes. And anyway, so this was Sigmund Freud is a psychologist, and he coins the term of psychological projection, where the attacker blames the victim. You accuse others of what you do. Little kids do this. I'm not the mean one, you're the mean one. I didn't start it, you started it, right? Or a wife beater will beat the tar out of his wife and blame her. Say, it's your fault because you provoked me. Or a Sharia man will rape a woman, say, it's your fault because you tempted me. Right? So the attacker blames the victim. So it's gotten into politics. And here's David Axelrod, campaign manager for President Obama, and he did an interview on NPR radio, April 19th, 2010. He said, in Chicago, there was an old tradition of throwing a brick through your own campaign office window and then calling a press conference to say you've been attacked. So you do the crime and you blame your political opponents. And it's done every day. Matter of fact, let's say there's a candidate running for president that's colluding with Russia, giving away a fifth of the U.S. uranium to Russia in exchange for $145 million Russian oligarch contributions to her Clinton Foundation. What does she do? She pays for a Steele dossier to accuse her opponent of colluding with Russia. That way his name gets associated with it in the media. And if it ever gets pointed back at her, by that time the water's muddied. The public doesn't know who to trust and she gets a pass. Let's say there's another candidate extorting Ukraine, saying, stop investigating my son or I'm going to hold back billions of U.S. aid. You want to accuse your opponent of extorting Ukraine. Their name gets associated with it in the media, and if it ever gets pointed back at him, then by that time the water's muddied, the public doesn't know who to trust, and you get a pass. By the way, they use it to do the investigation. It's just an excuse to subpoena all the evidence that can convict them and destroy it. destroy laptops, hard drives, cell phones, text messages, emails, right? They have the power of subpoena to take the evidence and destroy it. And then it started interesting when you study foreign aid. When you see these bills where they're going to give billions of dollars to third world countries for climate change or whatever, really the billions of dollars are going to corrupt politicians in these third world countries that funnel it right back into the coffers of these foundations of corrupt politicians in America. And anyway, so I did run for Congress 3 times, and so I did get a little taste of national politics. But now let's go back to Germany. After World War II, Germany it lost, so it gives up all of its colonies around the world. It had some colonies in Africa and the India, China areas, and then England gave up its colonies. And France gave up its colonies. And so you had new countries coming into existence after World War II. And these new countries would elect new leaders. And it looked hopeful, except the Soviet Union decided to send in KGB agents and do critical theory. And they would come into these countries that are struggling, and they would identify all the groups. Ethnically, Bosnians, Croats, Serbs; religiously, Sunni, Shia, Orthodox; economically, racially, didn't matter. And they would organize them into the categories of victims and oppressors, haves and have-nots. And then they would organize protests that they would escalate into riots and violence. And they would co-opt the media with bribes and threats to blame the new leader of the new country for all of the problems. And they would nurture weak links in the military. And when the country gets panicky and confused and fearful enough, that's when they would come along promising a solution, right? And they would do a coup or a rigged election and replace the leader with a Soviet puppet. Country after country after country was falling to the communists through this. They would do critical theory. They'd come in and they'd say, okay, in this country, these are the groups, and there's a little fault line tension between this group and that group. Okay, let's stir up this group. And this other country, there's other different groups. And they'd identify which ones. And as these countries were falling, Truman does nothing. He thinks the United Nations that he helped form will bring world peace. And while he's sitting there, these countries are falling under the control of the Soviets. So it's called behind the Iron Curtain. The next president's Eisenhower. Oh, by the way, China tweaks it a little bit. Instead of doing that Hegelian dialectic a couple times to seize power, Mao Zedong says, you keep doing it. It's called the continuous revolution theory. You keep having crises and you keep seizing more power, more power. You don't have to stop. So they would take the land from the rich farmers, and then they would take the land from the semi-rich, and then take the land from the middle-class farmers, and then take the land from the poor, until finally the government had all the land. It was like a continuous pandemic, right? We got another variant, another variant, another. We got to take away more. You got to squeeze. You got to milk this thing for all of its worth. So Truman does nothing. The next president's Eisenhower, and he says the United Nations has seemed to be two distinct things to the two worlds divided by the Iron Curtain. To the free world, it seems it's been a constructive forum. To the communist world, it has been a sounding board for their propaganda, a weapon to be exploited in spreading disunity and confusion. And so Eisenhower could do nothing or do something. And so he decides he's going to adopt the Soviet tactics and with our CIA. So 1953, Iran sides with the Soviet Union, and their leader is Mossadegh, and he nationalizes the country's oil industry. And you think, big deal, Iranian oil. No, wait a second. Britain has no oil fields. So in 1908, Britain formed the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. You know it better as BP. BP, British Petroleum, is really the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. And so Churchill helped with that. And so when the leader Mossadegh nationalized, takes control of all the Iranian oil assets, Britain is having an oil shortage. And they appealed to Eisenhower for help. And Eisenhower approves the first CIA operation to overthrow a country's leader. It's Operation Ajax. The CIA operative on the ground is Kermit Roosevelt Jr., the grandson of Teddy Roosevelt. Expert in foreign languages, he goes to Tehran, and he organizes mobsters and gangsters and radical imams, and he stages protests and riots, and they attack mosques, and they create all this confusion, and they co-opt the media with bribes and threats to blame Mossadegh for all the problems. They find weak links in the military, and when the country gets panicky enough, they do a coup. They put Mossadegh under house arrest, lock him away for the rest of his life where he dies, and they replaced him with the Shah, who loved America because we put him in. And the CIA did the same thing in Guatemala, 1954. Congo, Dominican Republic, South Vietnam, Brazil, Chile. And the motivation was patriotic. We were doing this because we want to keep these countries from falling into the Soviet orbit. But they did the same thing. And so you have Brezhnev and Khrushchev helping Yasser Arafat to start the PLO. Why? To sow division in the Middle East. Discord. It doesn't exist for peace. It exists to sow discord. And then Brezhnev and Khrushchev helped Castro to sow division, take over Cuba, and Brezhnev and Khrushchev helped Che Guevara to start FARC in Colombia and ELN in Bolivia to sow discord. And then they do hundreds of coups and coup attempts in Africa. This period of time is called the Cold War. And these tactics of going into a country, identifying the groups, pitting the groups against each other, and causing confusion and fear, and then the people panic and you can seize power, these have been perfected time and time again. The only difference this time around is we see these tactics being used on our own soil. And so a couple administrations passed, there was what's called the politicizing of federal departments. It's a nice way of saying that the IRS was co-opted under a previous president to target conservative groups. And the intelligence agencies have been co-opted to dig up dirt on political opponents. So the Cold War. Chris Matthews, remember him? In his last appearance on TV, there was a Democrat candidate debate where the topic of socialism came up, and he said, I remember the Cold War. I've seen what socialism is like, and I don't like it, okay? It's not only not free, it doesn't work. I believe if Castro and the Reds had won, there would have been executions in Central Park. Now, he must have said something that didn't fit right because that was his last time on TV. And what's he talking about, executions? Well, Castro had an executioner named Che Guevara. And Che Guevara said, we executed many people by firing squad without knowing if they were fully guilty. I'd like to confess, I discovered that I really like killing. Blind hate against the enemy creates a forceful impulse that cracks the boundaries of natural human limitations, transforming the soldier into an effective, selective, cold-killing machine. And people without hate cannot triumph. Right? Doesn't sound like the gospel to me. Anyway, coming closer to home, you have Chicago and Al Capone. And he has a hitman named Frank Nitti. And he had a young guy that rode around with him named Saul Alinsky. And Saul Alinsky witnessed that all they had to do was kill a few people, smash a few windows, and the whole neighborhood would panic in fear and be willing to trade freedom for security to the mob and pay extortion protection money to be left alone. And so Saul Alinsky says, you apply this to politics. And by the way, Hillary Clinton did her senior thesis at Wellesley College on Saul Alinsky, and President Obama was with the Alinsky's organizers in Chicago. And Saul Alinsky said the first step in community organization is community disorganization. Disruption of the present organization is the first step. The organizer's first job is to create the issues or the problems. The organizer must first rub raw the resentments of the people of the community. An organizer must stir up dissatisfaction and discontent. Fan the latent hostilities of many of the people to the point of overt expression. The organizer polarizes the issue, helps lead the forces into conflict. He must search out controversy, for unless there is controversy, the people are not concerned enough to act. You need to have an enemy to organize against. He has an acknowledgement in the front of his book to Lucifer. And this is what he wrote. I have a copy of the book. It says, lest we forget an over-the-shoulder acknowledgement to the first radical known to man who rebelled against the establishment and did it so effectively he at least won his own kingdom, Lucifer. Remember we started off with Lucifer sowing discord in heaven, and then sowing discord in the garden, Cain, killing Abel, sowing discord with Abimelech. All right, and then we have Machiavelli sowing discord. We got the British Empire coming in sowing discord. Right? We have Hegel, the idea of sowing discord thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And so this has been the politics we've been experiencing in America for the last generation, is the intentional sowing of discord and pitting groups against each other. You know, Jesus was tempted in the desert for 40 days, and the one gospel, it says that the devil took him to a high mountain, showed him all the kingdoms of the world in a moment of time, and said, all this I'll give to you if you bow down and worship me. And Jesus says, thou shalt worship the Lord thy God, and him only shalt thou serve. But it's sort of interesting, you say, well, when did the devil get all these kingdoms that he could offer him, right? When Adam sinned, Adam was in charge of the garden. We know that because he named everything. Naming means you have authority over it. You have kids, you get to name your kids. You got authority over them. And so when Adam named it, he was in charge of the garden. But the Bible says, to whomever you yield your members servants to obey, to him you are a servant. The moment Adam obeyed Satan, he was posturing himself as the person following the orders, and the devil as the one being in charge. And so that's when the devil usurped power. And every kingdom of this world is ruled through fear. And here's one of the kings, the Sultan of Delhi, India. Fear of the governing power is the basis of all good government. And so we see that the sowing of discord, we have all these different riots, and they all have a thumbprint of being organized. You know, I spoke in Emporia, Kansas, and former state rep had, we had the city, auditorium to have our meeting in, and they said, yeah, somebody dropped off a pallet of bricks right where they were going to start their peaceful protest. And there was no construction going on in the area. It just happened to show up. And then there's videos of Dallas, Texas, and a pallet of bricks just being dropped off right where they're going to have a peaceful protest. And I've talked to people all around the country. It's like, what a coincidence. In other words, a tremendous amount of organization went into this. Either the NSA is like totally inept. They're supposed to, I thought they were monitoring everything. They were going to find all this stuff. Or maybe they did know about it. And then there's some areas where the people just refuse to riot, and they import people from other countries that have a predisposition to rioting. Now, what was the COVID response? The first step was let criminals out of jail. Did you catch that? Sort of strange response. I mean, you couldn't think of anything else to do with the criminals? And then crime goes up. It's like, duh, you let criminals out, crime goes up. It's like, didn't see that coming. And then some people feel unsafe in the big city, they move out. Who? Well, maybe those with families. Okay, pro-family people. They usually belong to one particular political party. Who's left in the city? Well, maybe more people dependent on government entitlements. They tend to belong to a different political party. And then businesses are closed and looted and vandalized, and police are defunded and ordered to stand down, and so pro-business people move out of the big city. Pro-business people. They tend to belong to that first political party. And then churches are shut down, where a lot of pro-life social conservatives gather, and then schools are closed, and kids that have been indoctrinated with hate America are available to riot. It's like, who would want to organize students to riot? Well, Albert Hurlong, congressman from Florida, reads in 1963 these goals and tactics, and one of them was get control of the schools, use them as transmission belts for socialism and communist propaganda. Get control of teachers' associations, put the party line in textbooks, use student riots to foment public protests. 1963, they've been planning this. So the net COVID response was more people of one political party move out of the big cities, leaving the other party with monopoly control of city politics. And in presidential election years, whoever wins the big city, for some reason, ends up winning the state. And whoever wins the state gets all the electoral votes for the state, and the president's elected by electoral votes. It's a domino effect, right? Crime goes up, businesses shut down, churches shut down. One group of people tend to move out, the other ones get control, and then when they win the city, you know that only 6 counties were needed to win the election? All right, you got Phoenix, Atlanta, Detroit, Philadelphia, right? And all they had to do was just have those 6 cities, and they won those cities. They ended up winning the whole state and getting all the electoral votes for a state, and all those electoral votes determined the presidency. Anyway, so back to the 2 methods to take power from the people. One is fear. You get people afraid. They'll give up their freedom for security, and the other is free stuff. What's that? That's called the Great Reset. And Frederick Engels and Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1948, and then they wrote this, that they are alchemists of the revolution. Their business consists in spurring it into artificial crises. Every new crisis must be more serious and more universal than the last. Every fresh slump must ruin more small capitalists. This will increase the number of the unemployed. In the end, commercial crisis will lead to a social revolution. Could you imagine intentionally wanting to put businesses out of business? Why? Well, socialism is a two-tiered society of a ruling class and a ruled class. There's no room for a middle class. The middle class could pool their assets and challenge the ruling class, so you want to get rid of them. And here's a 1934 Chicago Tribune editorial cartoon, guy looking like Trotsky, writing, "Plan of action for U.S. Spend, spend, spend under the guise of recovery. Bust the government, blame the capitalists for the failures, scrap the Constitution, declare a dictatorship." It worked in Russia. So spend, 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 what's that? That's trillion-dollar stimulus programs and infrastructure programs that are not intended to stimulate and not intended to build the infrastructure. They're intended to cause inflation. Because you create trillions of dollars out of nothing, chasing the same amount of goods, the price of those goods is going to skyrocket. And people on fixed income are not going to be able to survive. And they're going to go to the government and say, help. And the government says, we will give you a check. And we're going to take your retirement accounts because you can't really buy much with them. If you want to continue to get your checks, we noticed that you haven't gotten your most recent booster. You're going to have to do facial recognition to file, and we'll take your privacy. And for some reason, we found out you have guns in your house. You have to give up those guns if you want to continue to get the checks. And it's going to incrementally take people along to the place that they've given up all their freedoms in exchange for this check. So it's called the Great Reset. They want to do this globally. They want to intentionally ruin the economy. And so people that are on fixed incomes will throw themselves at the feet of the government. And we had a little of that during the Great Depression in America. And in this time of poverty, FDR starts thousands or hundreds of these alphabet organizations and issues thousands of mandates and executive orders. And he's ruling the country through mandates. You know, one of his mandates was to confiscate the private ownership of gold. Just out of the blue. He's just going to confiscate it. People were burying gold coins in coffee cans in their backyards because of the president ruling through mandates. And so after FDR's New Deal, you have Lyndon Johnson's Great Society welfare state. And this is the government is now beginning to take over all those social programs that I told you about. So prior to this period of time, churches were the ones that started hospitals and orphanages and medical clinics and had feeding kitchens, very similar to what happens in third world countries with missionaries. Missionary will come into some country and that's poor, and the doctors will do hospital work for free, and they'll start schools and everything. That's the way it was in America. It was churches doing all this stuff. But it was co-opted during this. And so Lyndon Johnson and FDR got their ideas from this couple, Richard Cloward, Francis Piven, Columbia University professors who were socialists. And their attitude was, it's too difficult to institute communism through tanks. You just backdoor the country into communism through dependency. And so the Cloward-Piven strategy is you get as many people as possible to sign up for welfare, and then they'll basically be owned by you. You can count on their vote. I mean, think of it for a second. Imagine if you were getting a check for $1,000 in the mail every week from someone you did not know. Week after week, $1,000, $1,000, $1,000. After a few years of this, would you wake up one day and ask yourself, who is sending me this $1,000 check every week? I'm going to find out who they are and vote them out of office. Would anybody do that? I'd be like, my kid's got a few more bills to pay. Once you get people to receive free money from you, you can count on their vote, right? You control their lives. And so, anyway. Now, this is an interesting guy, Yuri Bezmenov. He was a KGB agent. And he said, people think of KGB agents as James Bond. He goes, no, it's a lot simpler than that. So he was going into India, and he was doing critical theory, identifying all the groups and which ones could be classified as victims and which ones as oppressors. And he began to have a pang of conscience that some of the people he was categorizing were slated to be killed. And so he defected, came to America, and 1980 he did an interview. It's on YouTube, you can watch it. But he says that people think, he says that their job was pretty bland. He says all we did was observe the country and observe all the groups and categorize the groups and then find the influencers of each group. And then in the media, in education, the pulpit, and then we would invite the influencers to parties, and we would lobby them to begin to put socialist lines in textbooks and into movies and into their sermons and so forth. And he says this period of time takes 20 years, but it's so thorough that if somebody is raised through this, you can take them to the Soviet Union, show them a concentration camp, they won't believe their own eyes. And he says the next stage of taking over a country is a shorter stage of a couple years worth of destabilization, debt, spending. In other words, spend under the guise of recovery. You basically weaken the country economically, and then you have a crisis, a particular incident that you can fan into flame and cause panic and fear to spread like wildfire around the country, and then in the middle of all that, you do your coup or your rigged election, and then you replace the leader with a Soviet puppet. And anyway, so I wanted to talk about the one aspect of influencing the pulpit. So there was a gentleman that, here is Albert Hurlong, a quote from him, 1963. He says, communist tactic is infiltrate the churches, replace revealed religion with social religion. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, 11 years in Soviet gulags, said, I call upon America to be more careful, prevent those from falsely using the struggle for social justice to lead you down a false road. So someone caught up in this was a black man named Manning Johnson, and he became a communist for 10 years. Even ran for Congress in the 1930s in New York as a communist. And then he saw some black businessmen were wanting to build a hospital and have it be first class. He says, Jews have hospitals, Catholics have hospitals, we want to have a hospital. And he witnessed the communists undermining their efforts. And then he saw some successful black businessmen wanted to have a real estate development and have it be first class with bridges and fountains and shops. And he saw the communists undermine all their efforts. Until he finally came to the conclusion that you guys really don't want to help my people. You're just using us to sow division. And so he left. He testifies before Congress. And he writes a book called Color, Communism, and Common Sense. Archibald Roosevelt, the son of Teddy Roosevelt, writes the foreword to the book. He says lots of things, but one I'm focusing on is he said how they first tried to do in the minority communities what they did in Russia. Get them to kick the Bible and spit on the Bible. And he says, but the people in the minority communities in America were too attached to the Bible. So he says their tactic was to change the gospel. He says the new line went like this. Jesus, the carpenter, was a worker like the communists. He was against the money changers, the capitalists, the exploiters of that day. That's why he drove them from the temple. Communists are modern-day fighters against the capitalists, the money changers. If Jesus were living today, he would be persecuted like the communists. So forget the gospel that we're all sinners and a just God deserves to send us to hell, but the just God sent his only son to die on the cross to pay for our sins. Right? Forget that. Jesus was just an activist. And we see some headlines of them wanting to infiltrate the pulpit even today. And David Horowitz, a former communist, became a conservative writer, says the issue is never the issue. The issue is always the revolution. Civil rights, women's rights is never the real cause. Women and blacks are only instruments in the larger cause, which is power. Battles over rights and other issues, according to Alinsky, should never be seen as more than occasions to advance the real agenda, which is the accumulation of power. So people that are on the street thinking it has something to do with Occupy Wall Street, hands up, don't shoot, safe spaces, the Confederate flag, or protest the statues and protest the Pledge of Allegiance. People that are on that bottom level that think that's really the issue, Lenin referred to them as useful idiots. David Horowitz saying, no, the real issue is just sowing division because you want to seize power. And now, CRT. We've all seen the little video of kids on a starting line, and the teacher says, okay, if you're from a home with two parents, you got a special advantage, take a step forward. And then if you're from a home that's in the has safe, and you have your own car, you got a special advantage. Take a step forward, take a step forward, until pretty soon some kids are way in the front, and other kids are still on the starting line. And the camera looks at their faces, and they're like sad, and it's a pretty convincing video until you ask yourself the question: what's the finish line? Talking about a race here. What's the finish line? Is the finish line how much stuff you can accumulate before you die and leave it all behind? Or is the finish line standing before God and him saying, yes, I blessed you with stuff, but what did you do with it? I was naked. Did you clothe me? I was sick and in prison. Did you visit me? Right? Whatever you did to the least of these, my brethren, you've done unto me. We all get different amount of stuff, but we all stand before God, and he says, okay, who did you help with the stuff that I gave you with? In other words, we don't need to teach critical race theory in schools. We need to send evangelists and have the call to greatness on the college campuses teaching them the gospel. Because once people feel the love and acceptance from God, they're going to want to love everybody. Do good to those that hate you. Bless them that curse you. Right? Walk the extra mile. That's the answer. Because when people change their behavior and do something out of critical race theory, they're not doing it because they love you. They're doing it because they're afraid to be canceled. Right? They don't really care about you. They care about themselves, that they don't want to be canceled. Wouldn't it be better to have people doing good things to you because they love you, and they're showing their love to you because they're doing it as unto God? And then what do you do with Ezekiel, where it says the child shall not pay for the parent's sins? So in other words, it's not a hardware problem, it's a software problem. You are a spirit, you live in a body, and you possess a mind. Your mind is like a super fancy computer. It's more than that, but it's at least that. And your body's like the computer case, which makes it silly for people to argue over what color the computer case is. Imagine if I were to say blue computers are better than red computers. It's like, really doesn't matter what color the computer is or what color the iPhone is. What matters is what apps are on it, what software is on it, right? It doesn't matter what color somebody's skin is what behavioral software is running on their brain. Is it the gospel? Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, right? Or is it selfishness? Is it a virus? Is it corrupted files? Is it malware? Is it spyware? The battle is who gets to load the software on the next generation's brains. And then I already mentioned this, Ezekiel 18:20, the son shall not bear the iniquity of the father, right? The soul that sinneth, it shall die. You don't make some little kid pay for some sin that some ancestor did, and they can never do enough, and for their whole life they're going to be a bad, bad person. That's not the gospel. The gospel says, forgive us our debts as we forgive others. Forgive us our trespasses. In other words, if you want to be forgiven, you have to completely forgive anybody that's ever done anything bad against you. And you will be forgiven to the exact degree. So if you're still harboring bitterness towards somebody, that is the way you're going to be treated. Jesus, the most innocent person, suffered the most unjust treatment. And what did he do? He forgave. Father, forgive them. He's our example. And then there's this parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a certain king settled accounts with his servants. Went out, there's one guy owed him 10,000 talents. The king forgave him. But as he was not able to pay, his master commanded that he be sold, and his wife and his children, all that he had, to make payment. And the servant therefore fell before him and says, Master, have patience, I'll pay it all off. And the master was moved with compassion, released him, forgave his debt. The servant went out and found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii, and he laid hands on him and took him by the throat and said, pay what you owe. So his fellow servant fell down at his feet and begged him, saying, have patience with me, I'll pay you all. And he would not, but went and threw him in prison till he should pay. When his fellow servants saw what had been done, they were very grieved, and they came and told their master. And the master said to him, Lo, you wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt because you begged me. Should you not have compassion on your fellow servant, just as I had pity on you? And his master was very angry, delivered him, tortured him, and so forth. And he says, so my heavenly Father also will do to you if each of you from his heart does not forgive his brother his trespasses. This is the gospel. This is Jesus talking here, right? You have to forgive everybody that has ever trespassed against you. You cannot harbor bitterness toward them. You cannot make them pay. You cannot make them pay for somebody that was past. And anyway, I go on and on. And so God is not a respecter of persons. And the law says, you shall do no injustice in judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor, nor honor the person of the mighty. Critical race theory says, well, you got to be partial to the poor to make up for the past. No, the gospel says that every person is, that those in judgment are not to show partiality. And then you do, this is a little bit interesting, but what do you do with President Obama? His mother was white. And can he cancel himself? Is he going to pay reparations to himself? Right? I mean, you think, well, that's a little bit of stretch. Well, no. Nowadays, you can feel things. I mean, here we have a male athlete that feels like a female, and he gets to win races and get awards and steal from these girls their scholarship opportunities. And now there's quotes of him saying that he's the Jackie Robinson of transgender sports. All he has to do is feel like it. So somebody could feel like they're a black transgendered woman and they say, oh, I claim I need to be treated bad and get reparations. It gets pretty confusing. And anyway, so I'm going to end with a little bit of the gospel if I can. We talked about crises. We talked about the usurping of power in times of crises. And for me, I gain encouragement when I try to see it from God's perspective. And so God loves you. He wants you to love him back. He can't force you to love him. I mean, he could force you, so he has positive and negative motivations. One is he blesses you and you turn to him out of gratefulness. The other is he lets things get a little bad, and then we turn to him out of desperation. So the crises, the same crises that, how many of you pray more when you're going through a crisis? Right? In other words, sometimes God blesses a people and they turn to him out of gratefulness. But if the people aren't going to turn, then plan B is he hides himself and he lets us reap the fruit of our own decisions, and it gets into a crisis. Then we turn to him out of desperation. His goal is to have us turn to him. So let's look at the big picture. God exists for eternity upon eternity upon eternity. There never was a time when God did not exist. And he makes everything. He made time, made space, makes matter. Just to explain how big God is. Hubble Space Telescope, 2003, they focused it on a spot in the sky where there was nothing. Tiny spot, the size of a grain of sand, held out at arm's length against the night sky. For 11 days, they focused the Hubble telescope on this little tiny spot where there was nothing. They developed the images. In that spot was 10,000 galaxies with hundreds of billions of stars in each galaxy. And because light travels in waves, with blue being the shortest and fastest, red being the longest and slowest, it had a red shift, which means the galaxies were moving away from us. And they do the parallax system where it's the Earth goes around the sun, and if you look at the same spot from every different position as the Earth goes around the sun, the closer stars move in relation to the further ones, so they can tell the difference. They found out these galaxies are 47 billion light years away. Then they look in the other direction, they begin to see. So the observable universe is 93 billion light years across, and get this, still expanding at the speed of light. And the largest star they found is Stephenson 2-18. It's a super gas giant. It is so large, if you were to place Stephenson 2-18 in our solar system, it would engulf the orbit of Saturn, the sixth planet from the sun. We're the third planet from the sun. Could you imagine one star that big? And God made it all. And he made you. You think of it, it's almost like God makes it all, and then he says, been there, done that. I can create galaxies. I can create an infinite amount of galaxies. It's like, what's a galaxy anyway? It's a bunch of rocks. Hot rocks, cold rocks, enormous rocks, vaporized rocks. A rock cannot love you. So at some time in eternity past, God said, I would really like to create someone in my image that could love me. Now it gets interesting, because love by definition must be voluntary. The moment it's forced, it evaporates. And if God were to force you to love him, he himself would know he's forcing you to love him, and he would know your response is not a pure love response. So in this framework of everything he controls, he created one tiny thing he doesn't control, your will. Now, he could control it if he wanted to, but that would defeat the very reason he made us different than everything else. And he hides himself behind creation, because if he ever revealed himself, he is so incomprehensibly awesome that every atom in your being would fall flat before him, like the Apostle John in the book of Revelation says, I fell at his feet as dead. And your response would be instinctive and not voluntary. People say, well, if God's real, why doesn't he show himself? Because the moment he shows himself, he not only would remove every doubt that he's real, it would remove your free will. In the presence of this almighty universe-creating power, you would be and instinctively worship him. It wouldn't be a free will thing. So he hides himself behind creation. I tell people, imagine if a billionaire has a son who goes to college, flies in on his private jet, drives up in his Lamborghini, Rolex watch, fancy clothes, rings, and an entourage following him around campus. He's going to have every girl on campus wanting to meet him. But if he lays all that aside, drives up in an old clunker, got holes in his jeans, right? The uppity girls are going to ignore him. But then there's some girl that likes to study with him in the library. They eat together in the cafeteria. And she takes heat from the clique for hanging around this nobody guy. But she believes in him. She loves him. They fall in love. They actually get engaged. And then he says, hey, I want to take you back to meet my dad. And they're like driving up to this castle mansion, and the girl's like, whoa, you didn't tell me about all this. He knows that she loves him for him, not because of all of his stuff. The God of the universe would have came down, everybody, oh yeah, I'm your friend. No. He's born in a manger, a barn. Isaiah 53 says there was nothing in his countenance that would make us want to be attracted to him. He only wants those that love him for him, not because of all of his stuff. So he creates it where you have a free will. Now the other side of it is he's a just God. He cannot help it. He's just. What does that mean? That means he has to judge every sin. He's a God of rules and laws. Laws of planetary motion, laws of gravity, laws of physics, laws of optics, everything's laws. And it's all built in layers. He makes the little quarks that makes the little proteins and protons and neutrons and everything in different layers. It's like computers. What are they? Right? You have a 1 and a 0. When I was going through college, we had to write Fortran and COBOL, and we'd have to do punch cards. But everything was just a 1 and a 0, and you say, if this, then that. But that had to work for the Windows to work, to have all the different apps work and all the programs work, but it's all based on everything following these exact rules. And God is a God of rules. But he has rules for human behavior. We just have the choice as to whether or not to follow the rules. But a God of laws and rules means he has to judge every single sin. If God does not judge a sin, his silence is effectively giving consent to the sin. In common law, it's called the rule of tacit admission. And you've witnessed it in wedding ceremonies. The pastor says, anybody against this wedding, speak now or forever hold your peace. If you're at the wedding silent, your silence is giving consent to the wedding. If there are sins going on and God is silent and not judging them, his silence is effectively giving consent to the sin. And if God gives consent to an unjust sin, he is no longer a just God. He denies his just nature. He denies himself. He ungods himself. He's kicked out of heaven. And he is not going to deny himself. So he is going to judge every sin. Years ago, I spoke in western Kansas, and it was really flat, and the pastor says, you can see forever out here, but there's nothing to see. Sure enough, it's cornfields as far as you can see. Their big thrill was to stand in the middle of the street and watch the street light turn the next town over, And it was like flat. And the worst thing that can happen is a hailstorm. And you can stand in the field and get hailed upon, or you can run in the barn. And the hail comes, but it hits the roof of the barn. Ting, 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 ting. Jesus is our barn. We are in. People say, I don't need Jesus. I'm just going to stand out in the field. It's like, dude, don't you understand? God has to judge every sin you've ever done, because if he doesn't judge it, he's giving consent to it. And if he gives consent to it, he's denying himself, and he's not going to deny himself, so judgment's coming. You can take it, or you can run in the barn. The hail comes, but it doesn't hit you. It hits the roof of the barn. Jesus is our barn. We are in Christ. He took the judgment in our place. So God is just in that he judges every sin, but he's love in that he provided the lamb to take the judgment for the sin. So there's an account of Abraham and Isaac going to the top of Mount Moriah. And Isaac says, Father, we have the wood for the sacrifice. We have the coals for the fire for the sacrifice. But where is the sacrifice? And Abraham says, Son, God will provide himself a sacrifice. And it has a double meaning. God will have a ram up in a bush, I'm trusting. Or the second is God will provide himself as the sacrifice. And that's what happened. Jesus, the only begotten Son of God, the second person of the Trinity, became the Lamb and took the judgment for all of our sins. You know, I was thinking about we're made in God's image and how a sin deserved justice and judgment. Every NCIS episode that you watch, right? Every crime starts off with an injustice done in the first 2 minutes. Some innocent person is killed. I hate the first 2 minutes of all those. And then you're held captive the rest of the hour, wanting the person that did it to be caught and brought to justice. You just know he's going to get caught. He's going to get caught. And then when he's finally caught, you feel his completion. Okay, the show's over. He got caught. In the book of Genesis, Cain kills Abel. God goes to Cain, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. What was the crime? An injustice is done, and innocent Abel is killed. You're a just God. You got to judge the guy that did it. That's the only side of God that the devil knew. Here's Lucifer, beautiful angel, puffed up with pride, wants to put his throne higher than the throne of God. God says, you have sinned, you're out of here. Cast him out of heaven. So the devil goes into the garden, sees Adam and Eve, and says, if I can get them to sin against God one time, God will have to destroy them. He'll have to judge them. Gets them to sin, it was pretty easy. Then he stands back and says, you're a just God. They sinned against you. You have to judge them, because if you don't judge them, your silence is giving consent to their sin. And if you give consent to their sin, you're no longer a just God. You deny your just nature. You ungod. You're kicked out of heaven. So God sends his fireball of judgment, but in steps the lamb and takes the hit. So God is just in that he judges every sin, but he's love in that he provided the lamb to take the judgment for the sin. So if you think of it, of Adam and Eve, they sinned and they hid from God. Have you ever sinned against anybody? You sort of don't want to be around the person you've sinned against. Let's say you're talking about somebody behind their back, making fun of them, joking about them. You look up and there's that very person and they're walking towards you. Question, are you drawn to want to go over to that person? Hi. Or you're like, oh man, I feel embarrassed. I was just talking about, I think I'm going to slip out the back. Your own conscience does not want you to be around the person you have sinned against. So when Adam and Eve sinned in the garden, they wanted to get away from God. It's like two magnets that are stuck together and one of the magnets turns. The first one wants to touch, but the second one wants to get away. So it's not so much that God sends people to hell. It's once people sin against God, it's their own conscience that makes them want to avoid God, to stay away from God. So Adam and Eve said, we blew it. We have to do something to make ourselves acceptable to God. They put on fig leaves. That was the beginning of false religions. Man coming up with man's idea how to make man acceptable to God. Did the fig leaves make Adam and Eve acceptable to God? No. And then we read this little line, God made Adam and Eve coats of skins. We read it really fast, but if you think of it, how do you make a coat of skin? Something has to die. You have to kill an animal. Do you think God went to the other side of the garden, killed an animal, and brought Adam and Eve some nice tailored outfits? Or do you think maybe he killed the animal right in front of them, and they witnessed the first death ever? All right, creation account, everything's just made, and this is the first thing recorded to have died, and Adam and Eve are watching this innocent animal go through the pangs of dying, and they're thinking to themselves, we're the ones that sinned, but this innocent animal is the one that's dying. And God wanted to make it really clear the animal was dying in their place, that right in front of them. He strips the skin off the animal, and he puts it on their naked bodies. Maybe it still had a little blood on it. They were covered in the blood. And so for the rest of their lives, Adam and Eve are wearing the skin of the animal that they watched die in their place. And whenever God sees Adam and Eve, he sees them clothed with the skin of the animal, the lamb slain from the foundations of the world. So Adam and Eve tell Cain and Abel. Cain decides he wants to worship God, but he does an offshoot of the church of the fig leaf, and he starts the church of the fruits and the nuts. Cain's was a religion of works. And we know it was works because God told Adam, the ground is cursed for your sake, and you'll bring forth fruit by the sweat of your brow. So Cain is sweating, he's working, he's getting all this fruit from the ground, he piles it all on the altar. Did Cain's works make him acceptable to God? No. And we read this, then we read Abel offered the lamb. And it's this picture, God is on one side, we are on the other side, our sins separate us from God, and the lamb pays for the sin. So Abraham offered lambs. Moses said, every family in Israel kill a lamb and put the blood over the doorpost of the house. The high priest brought the blood of the lamb into the Holy of Holies and sprinkled it on the mercy seat. You got remember the Ark of the Covenant and the angels on top and the Ten Commandments in there? The blood actually changed it from a judgment seat into a mercy seat. If the high priest would have approached without the blood, he'd been approaching the judgment seat. Solomon had 1,000 lambs killed when he dedicated the temple. Finally, John the Baptist points to Jesus and he says, behold, the Lamb of God that taketh away the sins of the world. So I ask people, are you approaching God as Cain or as Abel? If you're still hoping you're good enough to go to heaven, you're approaching God as Cain. I hope I piled enough stuff on the altar, maybe a couple more handfuls of barley. That'll do it. Or are you approaching God as Abel? It's not me being good enough. It's this lamb that was good enough to die in my place and pay for all my sins. So why did the lamb have to die? God's a just God. He has to judge every sin. And only by his son becoming man could God die. Jesus died on the cross. You know, I was reading the book of Revelation, still trying to figure it out. But one thing seems clear. It's God that's pouring out the vials of judgment in the book of Revelation. You know, the angel throws the censer down and the lightning flashes. And I thought, why is that? Well, God's a just God. So this is the final judgment. He has to judge every sin he missed along the way. So you can't get 10,000 years into eternity and say, God, there were these sins and you never judged them. No, it says the smoke of their torment rises forever and ever. And the angels cry out, righteous and true are your judgments, O God. So nobody's going to question for the rest of eternity that God is just. But in that sense, Jesus had the book of Revelation judgment poured out on his head. He took the judgment for every sin that everybody would ever do upon himself on the cross. That's why he's sweating drops of blood in the garden. You know, I have a degree in accounting, and I like things that balance. And so it says in the Bible, a day with the Lord is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as a day. Jesus experienced the day on the cross as if it was 1,000 years. And so you think of it as a scale. An eternal being, Jesus, who's innocent, suffering for a finite, limited period of time, is equal to all of us finite beings who are guilty, suffering for an eternal period of time. Let me say that again. An eternal being who's innocent, suffering for a finite period of time, is equal to all of us finite beings who are guilty, suffering for an eternal period of time. Infinity times finite equals finite times infinity. An unlimited being, suffering for a limited period of time, is equal to all of us limited beings, suffering for an unlimited period of time. Jesus literally suffered the equivalent of eternal damnation in all of our places. He's the only one that could have done it. That's how we can approach this universe-creating, all-perfect, almighty, powerful God and not have any consciousness of sin, not have any hesitancy in approaching him, because we're approaching him through the Lamb that he provided. As long as you think your relationship with God is based on you being good enough, you'll always have this nagging thought in the back of your head, did I do enough? And your own conscience will tell you, no, you did not do enough. You could never do enough. That very thought will cause you to hesitate coming into his presence. The moment you believe that Jesus paid for all your sins, all of them, yes, all of them. All of them, yes, all of them. As far as the east is from the west, so far as he removed you from your sins. He's blotted out all your transgressions. He's thrown all your sins in the depths of the sea. The moment you believe that, your magnet flips around. Boom, you're instantly in the presence of the Lord. You feel his love as an acceptance. And then you want to reach out to the lost and dying world, and it's him doing it through you. So instead of you doing good works, hoping to earn brownie points with God, piling all your little stuff on the altar, it's him doing the good works through you. And his yoke is easy and his burden's light. And you're filled with the Holy Spirit, the third person of the Trinity. And it's like God's magnetism overpowers you, and people are attracted to you, but not to you, the Holy Spirit in you, and they're drawn to Jesus, to the Father. Does this make sense? So today, if you've not yet put all your faith in Jesus, the Lamb of God, and you can approach this eternal, perfect, almighty, just God without any consciousness of sin, without any hesitancy, because you're approaching him through the Lamb that he provided. Anyway, I'll end with that, and we'll come back after lunch. So God bless you.